Welcome, everyone, to the Feminine Outliers podcast, your dose of fun, life advice, and experiences from two African professional women living and working in the Western world. We are your hosts, Cholwe Mandona,
And Zelda Wasau.
and we are excited to have you here with us today. So, for this episode, we are going to be diving into this phenomenon called the imposter syndrome. This, by the way, is the career series episode. So we will not be having unlearning pieces for this week. And so we're just going to go right into it. So
Mhm.
I am excited. I wouldn't say excited for this episode. Maybe the better word is I am glad to be talking about this because
Right.
you know what I mean? Um,
hmm
because it's something that I have personally experienced, and I know that, Anzel, you have experienced, we have talked about this, right? Imposter syndrome. So it would be a good time to reflect on this and just to see how far we have come along on this journey and how we're dealing with it or how we have dealt with it, and
hmm
hopefully this will help other people who might be experiencing this, and it may also give some language if you don't even know, or this is your first time hearing about imposter syndrome. So, yeah, let's get started. So, to begin with, I'm going to give a dictionary definition of imposter syndrome. Um, so, I'm going to get that definition from the Merriam Webster dictionary. So, what is this imposter syndrome? So, according to the dictionary, it says imposter syndrome is a psychological condition that is characterized by persistent doubt concerning one's ability or accomplishments, accompanied by the fear of being exposed as a fraud despite evidence of one's ongoing success.
Hmm.
Whew, that's a
That's a
mouthful.
lot.
I know. That is a mouthful. Um, but to summarize it, or to take away the most important words or terms from this definition, is having this sense of not feeling the success that you feel. So having a feeling of, as the dictionary said, self doubt of your
hmm
abilities, and wondering whether you should be where you are, um, in your profession, in whatever skills you may have, and yeah, and so it's just something that, I guess, from what I have known and even read, is something that a lot of people, both men and women, experience, but it's also a very common phenomenon amongst very successful people. Whatever,
Right.
you know what I mean? Yeah, whatever, however you define what success is. And so, yeah. Um, Zell, do you have any initial thoughts around this? I guess, as the dictionary says, psychological condition. And if you want to start us off.
Um, I would say that imposter syndrome is something that everyone experiences
Mm,
or everyone has experienced at some point in their life.
mm,
You might not have realized it, but I think most people can tell you at some point that I felt inadequate. I felt like I shouldn't be here or that I wasn't good enough for the task at hand, even though the fact that I'm here means I'm qualified for it. And I definitely, so I think that's just one thing in general. I believe that everyone experiences it. Now, how
Mm-hmm.
much you experience it, to what degree, how often, I think that depends a lot on a lot of other external factors, which we'll get to during this podcast, including, your environment, your culture,
Mm-hmm.
what the world thinks, the default settings and all that stuff. It all affects how often you experience it. Because I do think definitely some people experience it more than others. I
Mm-hmm.
think we've seen it experienced, or at least talked about more with women than men. And, there's a lot of other different factors that cause that.
Mm-hmm.
But so now that I said that, I feel like everyone experiences it. In a way, I'm like, how do we, I was going to say, how do we embrace it, but not necessarily embrace it by like just accept it, but like, okay, imposter syndrome is there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's somewhat a bit normal to have
Mm-hmm.
in certain situations. I mean, it's okay to doubt yourself,
Yeah.
but I think it's only okay to a certain degree. And then
Mm-hmm.
at some point, it's like, no, you shouldn't have this. Like, it's like, okay, the first time it happens, it's fine, but like, what are you going to do about it? That to me is like what I think of when it comes to imposter syndrome. Because is it something that I have experienced? Yes. Is it
Mm-hmm.
something that I am experiencing now? Yes, because I'm in a new transition in my life, a new job. So there's a whole new element of that that comes in. But is it something that is going to determine how the trajectory of my life, my career goes? And that's where I say no. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
where you have to put the brakes on and you have to be like, nope, I have something I have to deal with. But I mean, it's more dealing with imposter syndrome is so complicated because you also have to know where is it coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. You bring up a good point, and we can probably start from there around where does it come from. And I guess what we're talking about is having an extreme version of it or having a more sustained version, because as you
Mhm.
just said, it is normal to feel a sense of doubt, especially when you're starting a new position or you're just in a new environment. Um, so it's just very normal. But then if it keeps going on and on, then that's a problem, because then I guess it starts to impact the way you view yourself, the way you view others, the way you view your work. Um, so I think it would be interesting for us to dive into when have we experienced imposter syndrome, or when do you experience imposter syndrome. So um, when I look at my own journey, I started to notice that I experienced imposter syndrome, for example, in the workplace when
Mhm.
I I guess I didn't feel like I got the validation that I was doing the right thing. Um, so this idea that I didn't get a good sense of whether I was doing things right or I was doing things wrong. Um, and at the same time, I put this pressure on myself to make sure that whatever I did was perfect, because in that sense, and quote unquote perfect, in my mind I was like, I have to get this to a very stellar, I have to provide a very stellar product, because then that will justify that I've done the very best I could, um, and not really, and I guess it was just because I felt like I wasn't getting that validation, like this is good enough. um, and And I don't know for some reason whether it was also something cultural, where I just felt this sense that, okay, if I'm the only female or black female, African female in this work environment, then I somehow have to represent all the black females, all the African females, because this is like
Hmm.
an opportunity that I cannot mess up. And so I don't know. So all of these factors coming together, probably at once, just created this doubt in me, in a sense that it just made me to keep working extra hard and just putting in effort after effort, without even stopping. So it didn't even give me the chance to say, like, maybe I'm working too hard. Let me see what other people are doing. So that, at least for me, is my the symptoms, I guess I would say, of my experience with imposter syndrome. How about you? Where do you feel imposter syndrome, or when has it come up for you?
So it came up in different stages of my life. But it's all right. I kind of lost my train of thought because I was thinking about what you said about, you
Mm,
felt like you have to represent, the black women well, which is one of my pet peeves. I feel like, no, I don't have to represent anyone. I'm not representing the whole black female race. I'm just representing Zelda. But
mm,
I know that's not necessarily how society, quote unquote, thinks about it. But I was just
mm-hmm,
thinking about that statement you made. We can talk about that later. But I think the first time I maybe experienced imposter syndrome was in Miami University. Like, when you go for the medical, like when they had talks for pre medical students.
mm,
And you know how Miami was, I mean, it was a very non-diverse school. It was, I think, I remember when I was researching Miami, because my parents wanted me to apply there because their friend's child had gone there and liked it.
mm.
Miami University was the fifth least diverse university of its size in the US.
Oh, didn't
So
know.
that just tells you, that there was not that much diversity.
Mm-hmm,
And so obviously medicine in this country, there's not as many black physicians, it's mostly white physicians.
mm-hmm,
And um, so in Miami, I remember going for these pre-medical things, and it's just mostly a sea of white faces, and you don't really see like much melanin anywhere. And
mm,
sometimes I'd feel like, am I in the right place, or do I belong, or am I doing the right thing? Because at that point in time, I knew I wanted to do medicine because I knew it from the time I was in Kenya. So that's the first time I
mm,
felt like some sense of a doubt. Now, was it doubt because I was incapable of doing it? No. It simply
mm-hmm,
was just because there were not many people who, I guess, look like me. And it was just like a whole different dynamic that I was used to than what I was used to in Kenya.
mm-hmm,
Um, so that was, I think, the first time I remember experiencing it. Now, once and it would be the same thing throughout the different stages in Miami, just all with the same pre-medical stuff. But once I went to medical school, it wasn't much of an issue because my medical school was very diverse, and it
mm-hmm,
was so fun. I had so much fun in medical school. I mean, I hated
mm.
it, but I also had fun.
Yeah.
But I think when it came up again was when I became a resident physician.
Mm,
Uh, because now it's like, wait a minute. Okay, this is going to be kind of a funny one, but like when you introduce yourself, the whole thing is, do I introduce myself as resident doctor Zelda Wasau or Doctor So and So? Because the thing is
mm-hmm,
that you're not the attending physician yet, and there's
mm-hmm,
this part of this feeling of, oh my goodness, like I'm not yet a fully fledged doctor. I'm inadequate. I'm not going to, how will I introduce myself to the patients? Will they even listen to me? Will they, because I'm not yet the attending? And I remember that that was kind of a
Mhm.
funny way it popped up. And a lot of
Mhm.
resident physicians will tell you they had the same doubts as well. It's, you're not really sure how to go about that because you're
Mm.
still in training.
Mhm.
Or for some people, some patients, they lose, I guess, trust when they hear you're a resident
Mhm.
versus when you're actually in attending. Um, but I think the other way it started creeping up, and I started to notice this, and I notice it even more now that I'm working, is, one, being a female. I don't know what it is, but like I feel like the male, like in general, and this is something I've seen here in the US, back home in Kenya, it's as
Mm.
if the default physician is a male.
Mm.
So as a female, whether I was doing residency or still now, I get confused for a nurse all the time. And it also doesn't help that I'm a petite, young black female.
Mm. Yeah.
So it just looks nurse, nurse, nurse all the way. And sometimes, I mean, it doesn't bother me as much now. It never really bothered me as much, but it's still a bit annoying. And in your
Mhm.
head, you're just like, you see a white male physician and they never get questioned.
Mm.
It's not like someone doesn't doubt what they're saying as much as they might question what you're saying. They
Yeah.
don't get confused for the nurse. They might be the
Mhm.
nurse, but someone
Mhm.
will not automatically think they're the nurse. And
Yeah.
so it becomes this thing of, oh my goodness, it kind of creeps up to you a little bit. And just like, am I supposed to be here? Like, why is everyone calling me a nurse? And also in the same vein, I'm young.
Mm.
Again, a lot of patients kind of anticipate their physician to be middle aged or older. When you're young, it becomes another whole, you're a young physician. Like, do you have enough experience kind of thing? And when you're young, and it's my first year out, I know I definitely felt like I was not sure if I was competent enough to handle my patients by myself.
Mhm.
It's just a bit scary because now it's like their lives are in your hands and your hands alone. There's no one else who's telling you what to do, pulling the strings. It's you alone. And there's this kind of sense of, I don't know if I'm good enough to do that. And it's something I think I take comfort in the fact that a lot of resident physicians actually feel this um,
Mm.
out of training because I've been listening to some different like podcasts or different things, and I hear this is a very common phenomenon when you're coming out of training because it's new, it's your first
Mhm.
time alone, you don't know, so you don't feel competent.
Mhm.
But I always try to remember one of my attending physicians in residency telling me last year before graduation, she's like, "Oh no, I know you're ready, but you're definitely ready. We would not have graduated you if you're not ready." And that
Mhm.
reminds me that no, you actually are competent, you can do it. You don't know everything. No physician knows everything, but
Mhm.
you're ready for it. And obviously there's still things you're going to learn, but it's one of the things I've really been grappling with because it's just like, am I actually like going to be able to take care of these patients by myself? So that's another
Mhm.
way it really comes into play. And I think the combination of it coming into play and then me being young,
Mhm.
being a minority physician, where I feel like, as I said, you get questioned more. Your competency gets questioned more than
Yeah.
someone else's might from patients and colleagues alike. And I haven't really had as much of issue with. Actually, I've barely had any issue with colleagues in regards to that. Maybe just some cardiologists, because the cardiologists are really old. Like they're really the ones in my hospital are really old. I don't know why they don't have the young ones, but they're really old, and people have actually been complaining about them because they feel like they're a bit too old school.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
I just
Yeah.
feel like in general, I've had that. Like you just feel like, because I remember, I think I told you my first day. This was my first day. It was my second day. Okay, my second day, but it's my first day alone. Because the first day I was with someone, then the second
Mm.
day I was by myself. And we have multidisciplinary rounds, which you talk about. You talk with the nurses, social workers, physical therapy, occupational therapies, the nursing leaders. Basically, you go over your patients and see what the plan is, so that anyone who needs to do anything in that room can prepare and
Mhm.
get them out on time. And
Mhm.
I was sitting in the intermediate ICU, talking about my patient, and I was wearing gray, which for those people who don't know out there, gray is actually the color that techs wear.
Mm.
And then I was wearing gray, but I had my white coat on. And actually, I don't even know if I had a white coat on at that time because I don't think my white coat was there. But I had a stethoscope on my neck, and
Mm.
one of the nurses said, when I introduced myself, she's like, oh my goodness, you're the new physician. She's like, I thought you were the tech. And I'm not
Mm.
gonna lie, that threw me back a bit because just so you know, there are a lot of black techs in the hospital. So she's looking
Yeah.
at me, she's like, young black female wearing gray. But she has a stethoscope. So the stethoscope is what confused her. Because she's like, the
Mm.
techs would not be wearing a stethoscope on their neck. I
Mhm.
think it's things like that, those small things that kind of, she might not have thought about what she was saying beforehand. But if I head
Mhm.
up just like, so automatically I'm walking around and people don't look at me and think doctor.
Yeah.
So you already feel like you're not supposed to be there. It's just weird. It hits you like that. So it's things
Yeah.
like that that I feel like I've been affected, that have affected my, I guess, my first few years, and at least now my first year being independent. But it's the
Mhm.
thing is that none of this are surprising to me because
Mm.
I knew these things happen.
Mm.
So that's the only good thing in the sense that I expected it. I'm like, okay, I know this is what people think. But sometimes it can kind of get to your head and you're like, oh, so should I just be like this because people think X, Y, and Z? And I'm like, no, no.
Mhm.
But I would
Yeah.
say that's the biggest way. I would say the last thing I experienced imposter syndrome in, and I don't know if you experienced this as well,
Mm.
let's see, is in starting this podcast. Do you
Mm.
ever do you ever feel like it's a part of me is like, are you really sure you want to start a podcast? Do you have what it takes to actually be a successful podcaster? I'm not gonna lie, I
Mm.
do have a little bit of imposter syndrome when it comes to this. So yeah.
Yeah. I would say I did. I did a little, but the funny thing was that when we started, and I just it felt so natural to to speak, to talk and
Mm-hmm.
converse, because this is something that we do even if there was no podcast. We would probably be still talking like this. So kind of seeing that we could contribute and hopefully add value to people's lives by sharing what we're thinking and how we're living our lives. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
wow, this feels actually gratifying. So that imposter syndrome ness left the building pretty quickly, because then I could see the value that we're adding. So I think in terms of just like the plans that we have for the podcast, I think there's a bit of like, ooh, okay, we're gonna have to
Mm-hmm.
come up with a plan, and we're doing
Mm-hmm.
it. We're gonna do it slowly but surely, right? We're gonna come up with a plan and keep going forward. So yeah. Wow, Zell, I'm just thinking about everything that you have said. I don't even know where to start from. But I guess what I'm thinking is that it looks like for us, what sort of makes the imposter syndrome worse is the people around us, like the
Mm-hmm.
environments that we are in. They just exacerbate that situation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because when you're being told, like, like, oh, you're young, like you're a doctor and you're young, or you're the nurse. For me, I remember I was in a meeting, and one of the ladies was like, oh, we thought you were the new secretary. So this idea that, oh, you're being hired as an engineer and not a secretary. So, and nothing
Mm-hmm.
nothing on secretaries. Shout out to secretaries out there. But it's just, this perception, or I don't know if there's, I would say, perception or perspectives that people have of you without actually getting to know you and try and figure out like,
Mm-hmm.
who are you? I haven't seen you in the building. What are you here to do? But that
Mm-hmm.
assumption, like, oh, you're most likely here to do this job. Um, and that's a very, very, I don't know how to describe that, but I don't know if it's just the people's programming, like maybe the movies that people watch, or not
People's
having
biases.
people's biases, I guess. Yes. That this is not something that they see. And so it's like, wow, um, this is different, or like this is, yeah, this is different for me, seeing a person of color be a doctor or an engineer. Um, and I think for me, the it's not even sometimes the comments, but it's the questioning that I get. Like, I don't know if you experience this, where
Mm.
the people are trying to fish out as much information, which is not necessary. I'm sure, I feel like it wouldn't be the same number of questions, if if you know that this person is an employee of this company or this hospital, you can say, oh, nice to meet you, where are you coming from? But if it goes to the extent of like, oh, so which school did you go to? And I'm like, now I'm having to review which university I went to. And it's just like, there's almost that thing of like, can't you relate to me first as a human being? Like, tell me how cute my shoes look. Or like, be like, oh, I like your shoes, but not like in that one conversation, and that's the introductory conversation we're having. You want to know which university I went to. So it's, I find that a little bit too much. I may be exaggerating, but to me, it sort of seems odd when you first meet someone, because typically conversations just go from what you see, like face value, not in depth, like, oh, it kind of, I want to sort of track why you're actually in this room right now.
Uh, I mean, I don't feel like I get that a lot in general
Mm,
from, okay, one, I don't get that from colleagues because I feel like they know you're a physician. They give you the respect that a co-physician will get. Of
mm,
course, there are times in which they don't realize I'm the physician, and then they
mm,
realize, wait a minute, she's the physician, and then you could see the switch when they realize you're the
mm,
physician, and they're like, mm. But I do get it sometimes from patients. And I feel
mm,
like it happens more so with the elderly ones and particularly males. I don't know. It's males just tend to be the problematic ones. It's
yeah.
like, 'cause I know, like, it's this. It actually wasn't a patient; it was a family member. He's a
Mm,
pharmacist. I think he's retired pharmacist.
mm,
Anyways, he's like, you just gave 3 days of this medication, and we usually prescribe 5 days. I looked at him and I
mhm,
was like, yeah, because she's already had 4 days of antibiotics. She only needs 3 more days of antibiotics. So that's what we do in the hospital. We don't prescribe 5 days. What am I prescribing her 5 days for? She doesn't need 5 more days of antibiotics. And like he would
mm,
question me certain things, and I had an answer for him for all of them. And I think he realized and he just stopped. Because
mm,
I'm just like, I know what I'm doing. And I never told him, yeah, I've gone through the labs before. He's like, this lab, this number is higher. And I'm like, we don't usually care about that in the hospital. It's not really anything significant and this and that. So I have had it sometimes. It's not as, I don't find it as often
mhm,
because I do realize that the physician title does carry a certain nobility about it. Like
mhm,
that um, people will not question as much, particularly it's mostly just be patients and their families, if so.
mhm,
A lot of times people might not really, they'll respect it. Once they see the title, they'll they'll kind of tend to back off and everything. But yes,
Mm.
sometimes you do get those questions. And it's just like, why do you need more information? Or, oh my goodness, I mean, this is not like a question,
Mm.
but it's a this sudden look when it's again male patients, and it doesn't matter which race it is, male it's just male patients. You know, they look at you like it's like,
Mhm.
where are you like, where do you come from? They're trying to
Yeah.
like figure it out. It's like, wait a minute, they're wrapping their head around the fact that you're their physician. And it's like the expression, and I'm just like, I want to see at this one point, like it doesn't happen that often, but I'm gonna tell one of these guys to fix their faces. I'm gonna be like, can you fix your face? Like it kind of makes you
Mm.
like, why you look at me like that? It's as if it's not as if there's not like they're looking down on you, but they're trying to figure out, it's not adding up in their head. And it doesn't matter
Mhm.
for me what race it is. It's just I don't know. It's just males. Some males
Mhm.
that do it, and I'm just like, it's 2024.
Mm.
Why are you surprised that your that your physician is a female, or your patient's physician is a female? Um.
Yeah.
So,
Mm.
but I mean, I haven't had it as much. Now, I did have a colleague who she did mention before she left. I mean, because she was doing she went on to do something else, but she did mention that, I mean, she's gotten questioned before in which someone like a patient asked to be seen by a different physician, like actually a male
Mhm.
physician, because
Mm.
I guess they didn't trust her because she was young, female.
Mm.
And so yeah, it's this
Yeah.
weird things like, and again, this is outside pressure that's really affecting, that's really causing these things. And I think for me, one of the things that I really learned when it comes to handling imposter syndrome is one, accepting the fact that it's there.
Mm.
You know, when you accept the fact that it's there, if there's something that I can work on to help myself get out of imposter syndrome, then I will do that. But that's
Mm.
only if I actually accept the fact that it's there and I actually know what I'm dealing with.
Yeah.
But I think something that has really helped me is having a high self esteem, and actually
Mm.
not really caring what people think. Because I think I told you this before. Like, I would, I'm the kind of person who I would not mind. I mean, I don't do it because I know it'll make my life harder,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't mind going to the hospital with pigtails and with pink bows inside, like pink
Mm.
bows holding my hair, all dressed, gummed up in pink from head to toe, looking all girly. I would not mind doing that because in my head, I'm like, it does not make me any less of a doctor.
Mm.
However, I know it's gonna make me seem less of a doctor to other people.
Yeah.
So I don't
Exactly.
do it. But I think it's
Yeah.
that kind of thing mentality because I'm so strong in my, like, I have that strong sense of self.
Mhm.
Even when these things hit you, it's, I do recognize that this is outside pressures or biases that come from the narrative that the world has pushed out there.
Mm.
So when I realize that it's not me that's the issue, as long as, I mean, I've dealt with whatever parts I'm the issue with, but as long as I know it's not me that's the issue, I try to remind myself, well, just because so and so is shocked that you're a doctor does not mean that you don't deserve to be a doctor. You worked hard,
Mhm.
you put in the hours, it was sweat and tears, you made it. So
Mhm.
irrespective of what they say, you still are a doctor. And I think it's about how you also carry yourself around, because when you carry yourself with that confidence and people realize it, it also knocks them down a notch, or kind of like it makes them really second guess stuff because they're like, hmm. But I think that it's so important for me to deal with that, with having a strong sense of self, because that's a huge important thing for me when it came to dealing with dealing with now imposter syndrome.
Mm. Yeah. I do agree with you on having that strong sense of self. I think it's one way to, not one way, but it's one of the ways to deal with it. But I want to just quickly go back to the look. um, because there is a look, there is a moment of, I don't even want to like when someone meets you for the very first time and they're not anticipating that it's going to be you,
Hmm.
or or me, and their brain just somehow, like, there's just new neural connections happening in their brain, and it's just like, Okay, so this is different."
Hmm.
And for people who maybe don't have, like a high emotional intelligence, you can just tell that, like, they are just super surprised that you're in the room right now and you're the one going to speak to them. um and it's funny, I think I was, I want to say, threatened by it, but that, to me, that's when my imposter syndrome would go even further up, because in my
Hmm.
mind I created the narrative that, oh wait, am I not supposed to be in the room? Like, obviously, I wouldn't say that. Um, I wouldn't say that in the open, but that's the narrative that's the question I would be asking myself. Um, and so, and then after that, I from that narrative in my mind, I would then be saying, okay, so now I have to impress these people. I have to do the very best. I have to show them that I need to be in the room. But as you were saying, from your viewpoint, if in that moment in time, if I had a high sense of self esteem, and just understood it's a phenomenon, it's not me, then I probably wouldn't even have to say, oh, I have to impress them. I just have to do my job. There's no need to go
Hmm.
the extra mile of having to impress. Because this is where, like, maybe I don't know if I've ever done this, but I'm just let me give a hypothetical example. Like, maybe instead of using just an everyday word, I then, in my mind, I have to think, oh, I need to use a very complex word that showcases my intelligence. So,
Hmm.
that kind of thing. And even, like, as you were just talking about your outfit, because you have this uh high confidence, to you wearing pigtails and a pink outfit still makes you the doctor that you are. But I'm thinking of some people that show up at work, all dressed up, maybe an expensive suit, or they go all out because they want to show that they are the professional that they are. But could that be, like, an example of imposter syndrome, where it's, I need to show up in a way that, because I can't show up within myself as confidently as I could outwardly, so I'm gonna do something from the outside to show up more confidently. So, um, but now I see that, no, there's no need. If you, as we have talked about this in previous podcasts, that, intelligence has no gender, has no it has no outward expression. It's everything, it's internal. So if you have the skills to do what you have to do, you decide on how you want to express yourself. But of course, we have a collective society, so you can't also just go about your day in the streets looking in any way.
You have to think about it. I mean, it's funny because it just, I know my boss has tried getting us to wear formal clothes because people seem to, I guess, respond better. It makes you seem more respectable as a doctor than
Mm,
wearing scrubs. And so they feel like, oh, my doctor is all dressed up. And it just gives a different, I guess, air. And I don't know, which I see where people are coming from, but I think this is something that's been taught to us.
Mm,
I like, why do
yeah.
we have to dress up for you to take us more seriously? Like, I can still look good in my scrubs. They can
Mm.
be ironed well, um, the nice collars and everything fitting me well. And nowadays we have really
Mm.
cute scrubs. But anyways, that's just a caveat to what we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about. But yeah.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to bring up, I guess this is probably for more immigrants, like people that have left their home countries, similar to us, and there is there are these shifts that happen, in the sense that, one, okay, we have left our home countries, and so we are our culture is has changed, and we're having to deal with a totally different culture, um, but also there's also this part of that, like an economic shift. So I'm going to explain this a little bit better. Like, I know several people, actually a lot of people, that it has been an opportunity to move to this part of the world, for better, career prospects. But having to get to this point hasn't necessarily been that easy. In some cases, some people have had to save up, whatever, however much money they needed to get to the US, the UK, wherever they may be. And even just going to school, for example, back home is a big deal. Paying for school fees, just getting your child, or an education from K to 12, and then further on for university. It's such a big deal, in these cultures, right? So when an individual then, like ourselves, graduates with a professional degree, it almost feels like there is this need to also perform, um, when we get into the workplace. And that's what I was trying to talk about, that feeling of representing the Black African females, even though it's just me. But there's just this, at least for me, it started off as there was just this initial pressure, because to my family, to my community, it was just such a big deal that I graduated to begin with. Seeing, where I came from, and seeing, just how the situation is from an economic standpoint is vastly different, um, from the Western world. Um, so in a way, I want to say that a part of my imposter syndrome, uh, was based on my own narrative of what it meant for me to have a job. Maybe for my Caucasian colleagues, it just was a job. It's just a job. They graduated from school, from college, and they got an opportunity. It was probably in their same hometown, so they didn't even have to move. But for me, there's a lot of shifts that I had to make to get to the same point. Um, and so, whenever there was someone doubted me, it felt like I needed to, overachieve. So I was like, oh yeah, that means I have to do more. And even just started, I probably was creating narratives of how my colleagues see me, or how people see me. Um, but yeah, I just thought I mentioned that because I'm sure there are people that feel a similar burden as I felt. But I will say that over the years, I've come to realize that, okay, um, no, I'm not representing every Black African female. Um, and so that already just has taken off that pressure. And the other thing I've realized is that I can inspire people, but it's not that every Black African female on the continent wants to be in the same position as me. Just realizing that it's not everyone. And people can be inspired. Those two have to go through the same process. But I am honored if people are inspired by me to by the journey I've taken. So yeah.
Hmm. Um, okay. I mean, so basically, that's what your background and what you experienced kind of just made the imposter syndrome worse, in a sense that heavier.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
the burden of the imposter syndrome heavier because of what you feel like, where you're coming from, what you've accomplished, and all you've been through to be here.
Mm-hmm.
So it just made it worse. Um,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, I would also say, I mean, I think we need to talk about how to deal with imposter syndrome because that's very important. We haven't actually properly discussed how to deal with it. But I would say to jump off what you were saying, that I think you brought up, I guess, another point that for you, for coming from Zambia, coming to work in the Western world, that just adds an extra layer, as you said, of kind of self doubt when it's one of those things that affects uh, that added on to you feeling like you wouldn't make it, particularly when other people, the world is telling you, hmm, really, like you made it. And it's
Mm-hmm.
because like, so I see where you're coming from, because that's just it's a very valid thing that people deal with, particularly when they leave their home countries and going to work in another place. So I think that's
Mm.
important to recognize as well. And why am I saying it's important to recognize? Because when it comes to um, dealing with when it comes to dealing with resolving your imposter syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
you have to know what triggers it or what's
Mm.
causing it. And I mean, I did talk about it. Some things that helped me briefly was like having high self-esteem
Mm-hmm.
and knowing that the narrative that's being pushed out there is something that's been pushed by the world and or society. It's not really, it doesn't say anything about you. It's more
Mm-hmm.
so about society.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me, it's the things that have helped. But what are things that you can say have really helped you when it comes to dealing with imposter syndrome?
Mm. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good question. And um, uh, I think the first thing uh is, as I mentioned, like offloading this sense of being, how do I say this, a representation of every Black female African or any person that has a similar background as me. It doesn't mean that I don't see myself as a role model or I wouldn't accept that title. Um, but the thing is that when, especially if people are not knowledgeable that okay, these are the things that you're doing, it doesn't matter. Like maybe the Black female person back home wants to be a supermodel. Like so, me being an engineer does not necessarily directly correlate to like, oh, I need to represent her. Like she probably needs to get her representation from, I don't know, Naomi Campbell, but not from Cholwe Mandona. Like so just kind of realizing that you're like just being somewhat realistic of who are you really representing, and shifting that representation to no, you're representing yourself. And from representing myself, I can, it extends obviously then to, it represents, my family, like my parents, how they raised me, the principles
Mm-hmm.
they taught me. That is what is being represented, all the way down to my grandmother, my grandfather, my great great grandmother, my great great grandfather, because all of their works, their principles in life have led to this point of where, like, this is the product they have made, and so that is what I should really start looking at, my own self and then my own family circle. So as a result of that, I feel like it gave me more energy to then start looking at what is the world trying to tell me, and to be able to resist that. And it's going back to this idea that I basically started putting the energy into myself, and that raised my self-confidence. It raised, like, I realized I have this high sense of self, like, oh my goodness, like, I am so grateful for the way my parents raised me, like what they, like, their messaging. They I think we talked about it on a previous podcast about how we were raised that we can be anything, that we want to be. So I had to go back to the teachings of my family and say, "Oh my goodness, no, this is so amazing."
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so proud of my parents. I'm so proud of my community, because this is the product that they have raised. And it's so funny now that I'm even at a point where when someone doesn't pronounce my name right, I correct them. And I even crack a joke to say, "Yeah, I'm sorry. This is what my mom gave me. I'm not changing it." And sometimes people would say, "Oh, do you have a nickname?" I'm like, "No, you just have to get used to it. Um, this is this is it. This is what this. I only have one life, and this is the one name I get. And I'm gonna use it. If you can't pronounce it, you better learn it." So it's gotten to that point because then now I'm like, oh yeah, this is so so cool. That this is my lineage, and I'm just gonna go forth with it. So that was one thing, is raising your confidence for sure. Um, and having to also just be around positive energy, reading books on women that have risen in their careers, have had
Mm-hmm.
successful careers. So just realizing, like, oh wow, there are other people that are successful, just like me, and
Mm-hmm.
they've been, and honestly, the starting point for most of the successful women I've read about is that they started believing in themselves first. Um,
True.
yeah, and so just putting that energy, and developing this, like, very solid personality, like very very strong, like, um and in a way that even other people can start to defend who you are and say, oh yeah, Chole wouldn't like this, Chole likes this, Chole does this. And so now I crack up when people talk about who I am and stuff like that, because it's like, oh yeah, I people had to learn, people now learn how I want to be treated, I guess.
Mm. I would say another thing I thought about that
Mm.
would helps me deal with imposter syndrome. I think it's something that can help us all. It's is if you feel inadequate or incompetent in something. First of all, just make sure you're actually competent in the actual issue, because you might be
That's true.
feeling inadequate in something. Like, for example, with this podcast, I still feel, as I told you, I have a bit of imposter syndrome with this, but there's
Mm.
still a lot for me to learn. So, what am I
Yeah.
doing about it? I
Yeah.
need to go out there. I need to learn more about how to be a successful podcaster. How what do people do? What does it take in them to run their podcast and things like that? Like I have to deal with my incompetencies because sometimes
Mm,
you have imposter syndrome because of actual incompetencies in your life, one way
mm,
or the other. So if
yeah.
there's actually something you need to work on, then work on it, because that would also help with your imposter syndrome, because that's actually actual valid tangible point. Like, yeah, you don't feel like you don't know how to wash the car. Well, maybe because you've never learned or bother
Mm,
try to do it, so that's why you feel like, oh, I can't do it. But it's because you
mm-hmm,
actually don't have the skill set to do it. So I feel like if there's something in particular that you just need to build a skill set to do so, we just need to learn how to do it. I think it's so important, because I'm not going to lie, there's some things we have imposter syndrome around, and we literally just need to put our working boots on, and just learn how
mm-hmm,
to bridging that gap. And I think for me, that's like one of the ones that kind of like rebukes me in a way, because I'm like, I just need to remind myself. So if, for example, if I feel like at work sometimes in certain cases I don't feel competent in working, like I'm not really sure, you know, and what
mm-hmm,
do? I go and I read up on it, because that's why I'm feeling like I'm not adequate enough to handle this, but I just need to go up and read up on it. So I think that's a
mm-hmm,
very practical way of handling imposter syndrome that a lot of people might not think about. But in some cases, it's not just what the world is telling you or
mm-hmm,
outside forces, but it's what you actually haven't done, or your own deficiencies that are actually causing, or making your imposter syndrome worse. So why not deal with them
mm.
if you can?
Yeah. That's a very good point because I can see situations where people are quote unquote demanding respect, but they are not producing value.
Hmm.
So it's that thing. And you sort of bring this idea of because now I have had more experience in my profession. It's, when new graduates come in and they start working, there's already, how do I say this, there's this assumption that they don't have the experience that I have, and so um it's it's what you're talking about is like being quote unquote a rookie or a person that's just starting. And I feel like we are rookies in like in so many things in our life. It doesn't even have to be our professional
Hmm.
life. Like as you said, in this, even like with the podcast. So we're still learning as we produce this podcast. um and I think what that requires is humility, like being humble that, yeah, I just don't know what
Hmm.
I don't know, while still doing the very thing that you're scared to do because you don't think you have the competency. So it's like there are two things that are happening. So I'm sure that by the time we get to our 100th episode, we're going to be looking at this episode and being like, oh my goodness, why did I say that? Oh, we shouldn't have done it this way, because we would have learned so much. um and so I really like that. I really like that. It's actually just getting good at what you want to get good at. So,
Hmm.
um, another thing, and I think you touched on this about validation. Um, I have come to appreciate like groups or committees or organizations that have representation. For example, like in our case, like black representation, female representation, um, just because then you start to realize how common like imposter syndrome is. Um, and just realizing that, wow, my experience is not unique, per se. Other people are experiencing it. And so when, people come together and they just validate you that, oh, yeah, like, yeah, I've had this before, or this is what I'm going through. Um, and even if it's not a group, it could be a senior person, somebody who has already gone through that process, and
Mm-hmm.
they just tell you and like, oh, you're doing good, like, good job, well done, just keep going, um, like, just keep going through it, and you get out on the other end. Look at me, I made it. I think seeking that, um, those resources is very helpful, um, to
You can
validate your
also
experience.
include like just the internet, going on Google, go to YouTube, type in imposter syndrome, see what people have to say about it.
Mm,
Just it can be as simple as also doing that, just simply typing in on Google, doing an internet search, because you don't know. One of the biggest things is if you suffering in silence is just one of the worst things, because
yeah.
everything is going to be compounded. You think you're the only one who's dealing with this issue, and then you realize when you actually just go out there and try to build some community or find resources about other things, that you're not the only one, and it helps. And also other
Mm-hmm.
people might also have some kind of resources or something that might be able to steer you in the right direction or help you. So I think that's a really important one. Don't suffer in silence alone you know
Yeah. And another thing to do, or maybe just kind of be aware, is recognize if you are in an environment that has a limitation of or has a limited view of
mm,
you. And I think this is talked about even, as you mentioned, in books, where you want to be in an environment where people can see you, progressing in your career. But sometimes
mm,
people might think, oh, this is the only level that you're going to get in this company or in this position. So you want to be around people that have a higher view of you, like, to the, if people can see you running the company, then that's an environment to be in, right? Like, you don't want to be in an environment where people have a limited view of you, because then it just means that your opportunities for growth are going to be stifled. Um, because as you mentioned, Zell, there's just, unfortunately, there are people's biases that are very strong. And we talked about this look, and people can't just wrap their heads around the fact that, you are a professional and you've gotten to this point. And if they can't wrap their heads around it, it may be something to consider and say, maybe there's a place where people will just accept me for all my achievements and my accomplishments, and they want to embrace it and see me grow. So it's good to be aware of your environments as well and make a change if
mm-hmm,
you need to.
mm-hmm. Agreed.
Yeah. So anything else? I feel like I've given very solid,
Nope.
uh, ways to deal with this. Yeah. Okay. Wow. This has been this has been good. Um, I feel like I've come a long way. The fact that I'm actually able to talk about this and even give solutions, um, and just, yeah, and keep going forth. And now, to an extent that we, as you said, we have a podcast, right? And so, um, the possibilities of what we can do when you don't put a limit on yourself and don't let others put a limit on you
Mm-hmm,
is actually pretty cool to see. So, I hope, you have enjoyed, this podcast, and it is something that you can, leverage and utilize in your everyday life. Um, there is more to life than the imposter syndrome. So the hope is that you don't let it, I don't know, degrade your life in a way that you feel stifled and you can't progress. Um, and if this is something that is helpful for a person you might know, please share it with them. Um, and hopefully it can serve them. Um, but yeah, if you have any questions for us around this topic, please write to us at the feminine outliers at gmail.com. And you can get this podcast, and you're obviously listening to this podcast, but it's all over on all the major podcast platforms. So you can tune in on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and every other directory that has podcasts. So um, this has been great. And thank you guys for tuning in. So until next time, have fun, live large, and don't be afraid to be an outlier.